there. Okay. But if he pushed him without malice, afterthought, or hurled any objects at him unintentionally, or inadvertently drop upon him any deadly object of stone, and that resulted, though he was not an enemy of his, and that he did not seek his harm. Okay. To such cases, the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood.
Where's the,
Okay. Yeah.
let's move it down a little bit.
Okay. Or, okay, blood. Okay. The assembly shall protect, I'm on 25. Okay.
Yes.
The assembly shall protect the manslaughter from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who was anointed with a sacred oil.
Right.
But if the manslayer ever goes outside the limits of the city of refuge to which he has fled, and the blood avenger comes upon him outside the limits of this city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, there is no blood guilt on his account.
Okay. And
okay, last one, last verse, verse 28. I need verse 28.
Yeah. Just, I overmoved it.
Okay, verse 28. For he must remain inside the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to his land holding.
Okay. So now this is it has always struck me as being a peculiar law. What as the text points out, I think a little confusingly, there is essentially a time limit for the revenge that somebody might take against somebody who commits manslaughter. And the limit is defined by the term of the high priest. So up until the time when the high priest, who was in power when the event took place, until that time, the manslaughter has to remain in the city of refuge that he chose to live in, and he can't go outside. And if he does go outside, he loses the protection of having been in the city of refuge. So the protection is a qualified protection. Somebody who commits manslaughter is not protected indefinitely, but only until the death of the high priest. When the high priest dies, then he's not liable for revenge to be taken. So this is a strange kind of law. Let's speculate a little bit to begin with. What rationale or what value do you think might be pointed to here? I mean, considering the fact that the manslayer, is protected without qualification while he's in the city of refuge, two things can cut short that process. He goes outside and the high priest is still alive, then revenge can be taken. On the other hand, if he does go outside but the high priest has died, then he's not liable uh, for revenge. What's the sense of that? What's the rationale?
I mean, I don't quite understand. It could be as short as 4 weeks, or it could be a dozen or more years.
You're right. I mean, if let's say the manslaughterer goes into the city of refuge, and the high priest happens to be a youngish man, uh, it may be that he remains alive for, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years, whatever. And if that's the case, as long as the uh, the aggrieved party remains in the city of refuge, he is protected. What is the nature of this protection? I mean, why would it matter whether the high priest was alive or not? Why would it matter whether the manslaughter was in the city of refuge or not? I see Ramey's hand.
Yes, sir. I'm thinking, could it be stay at the city of refuge
Yeah.
depends on the lifespan of the high priest.
Yes.
Could it be because the high priest, that happened under the jurisdiction of that high priest?
Right. But the question, I think that's true. But what I'm asking is a question that occurs to me as an implication from that. If the issue, hi Deb, good to see you. If the issue is what is the manslaughterer liable for? What sort of guilt does he incur? Why would it matter whether or not the high priest who was alive when the event took place was still alive or not? I mean, it's kind of a crazy idea when you think about it. It would be like saying, well, there was an angry mob and somebody inadvertently killed somebody else, and somebody might want to take revenge, but their desire to take revenge is qualified by whether or not the high priest is available. The same political and religious authorities are still alive. Somebody's at my door, and I'm going to have to deal with this. I'll be right back.
Hi, Debbie.
So nice to see you, Judy. How are you?
See you. I'm good. Thanks.
Good. Looks like you're keeping safe and healthy.
Yeah, you too. Has anybody gotten the vaccine yet?
Not me. How about you?
Not yet, but we're getting information about where, it's going to be, or maybe, or register.
Really?
Something.
Because I'm finding that even getting the information is like a rabbit hole. It's constant, or like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
Yeah.
1 minute it's there, 1 minute it's not. It's hard to know.
It is hard to know.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
if you find out anything, let me know.
Skedaddled, so we'll forget that for now. All right. So let's say that somebody commits an offense, whatever it is, and they seek the protection of whatever place there may be that will give him shelter. Now the legal authority, say the king or the president or the judge who was in power when the event took place, has now died, and now all bets are off. We wouldn't normally do that in our jurisprudence. doesn't matter if the chief of police or the sheriff or the king or the president is alive or not. If you are guilty of some offense, you are guilty depending upon the sentence you receive, but it doesn't hinge on the life of the individual who is in charge of the system. So let's say, although we're having kind of an odd sort of discussion almost along these lines right now regarding the impeachment of our erstwhile president, whether or not it's a good idea to impeach the president when in fact, having the trial might not take place while until after he's no longer president. But we all think that's kind of an iffy proposition. Some people support it, some people don't. I happen to support it. My general position on Donald Trump is that we have to find his thumbs and string him up by the thumbs, and we can do that at any time. That's just me. We normally see somebody is liable for X number of years. And when a certain period of time has elapsed and somebody has paid their debt to society, then they're no longer responsible for it. But we wouldn't say that they're responsible for whatever punishment they are liable for until the arresting police officer happens to die. So I'm asking the question, you see, Remy, I'm asking one question further along. We understand that there is some kind of limit, but the question is, what kind of limits count? Is there some absolute or abstract kind of definition of how long you are still guilty and liable for punishment? Or is it more particular and somehow related to the personalities that are involved, the individuals who are involved in the running the legal system? Yeah, Deb.
So one thing that I think is troubling to me about that idea is that it makes it very subjective. So we're essentially saying there's no impersonal standard by which a person is judged guilty or innocent, and how we know whether they've made their amends or not. It's just very, it just becomes very personal, and that makes it hard then to make justice from the standpoint of the way that I think of justice.
That's a very well put way of stating the question that I was stating in a much more confused way. Yeah, I mean, the idea is are the standards for being punished for committing a crime impersonal and abstract, or are they somehow involved in personality? And what is being said here is that somehow there is a personality component. So the question I'm asking is, what is the rationale? What is the explanation for making the protection or lack of it for somebody who has committed a crime depend upon the particulars of the legal authority of his day, the legal authority that obtained when the event took place? How could it be, for example, be considered fair if somebody commits manslaughter and then the high priest dies a day later, and now all bets are off and they are no longer liable to be punished because the high priest has died, whereas somebody else might have done the same thing, but the high priest happens to have lived for many years afterwards. Yeah, Deb.
So, it makes me wonder if then there's always reason to be suspicious of whether the high priest was acting in a way that was truly reflective of the people. And that's why the terms of the sentence were only tied to the longevity of the individual who had offered that opinion or that consequence. But then that makes me wonder, because up throughout our reading of Torah, we've been talking about how knowledgeable the high priests were and how, and so I sort of question my own thought right away and go, well, I don't know, would the priests make a mistake about that? Would they be so subjective and so biased?
Well, that's interesting, and it's kind of moving in the direction that I want to consider, because we have to ask ourselves a question: what impact or what force does anything about the high priest has to do with how and for how long the person, the manslaughterer, is to be liable for it? I mean, how is this possibly related to the personality or the particularity of the high priest? Stan, do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, I look back at the beginning of today's session, and the high priest is not involved in making the determination. It's the assembly of the people.
That's true.
So he's in Jerusalem, they're in Beersheba. He may not even be aware of it.
Well, see, so that you're introducing yet another. I'm gonna be very patient.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
Kerry, is our tuition due now? Have we officially started spring semester?
Yes.
I don't mean Kerry, I meant Kim.
I don't know that we're doing it still by semesters, but it's approximately 3-month periods.
Okay, I just wondered.
That's how we used to do it. I don't know how it's being done now, but we used to kind of tie it to sort of like January, and then it'd be kind of like June, and then it'd be like August and whatever. So January is usually the time I think of as being time to make another tuition payment.
Okay. Thank you all very much. I appreciate
Was I have a question about the high priest. Was he the same one making the judgment that this person would go to the land of refuge?
Well, I think that what was just being pointed out is that the high priest is not involved in that. Person simply has the option of running to one of the cities of refuge, and once there, they are protected by living in that particular place. I mean, there's another question too, just a near question from that. What is it about a city of refuge or any geographic location which would somehow mitigate for however long the responsibility of an individual for some kind of violent act? I mean, why should it make any difference whether you are in a city of refuge or not? Why don't we just say that as long as the high priest is alive, you're okay? How does geography fit into this at all? Yeah, Stan.
I'm wondering if the citizens of the cities of refuge were incumbent on enforcing the dictum.
Well, that's the corollary question. What is the responsibility of people who are not living in a city of refuge because they had committed some offense, just average citizens who happen to live in that locale? What is their job? What is their responsibility in the protecting of somebody who has committed a violent offense? Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is, we know from the end of this thing that the person, after the high priest dies, he can go back to his land holding. Okay, from that, I'm going to make the assumption that he either had animals that he raised to make a living, or he was farming. What does this person who is an agricultural worker do in a city? He can't go outside the walls and help. So how does he support himself? Are the people in the cities of refuge not only supposed to protect him, but feed him and all of the rest of it? And can his
Very
family
good
join him?
question, Dan. Yeah, I mean, there are so many ways in which this seems to be full of inconsistencies that it's hard to imagine how it would ever be enforced.
Yeah, do we
Even
know?
outside of- Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Well, do we know if this actually occurred?
That's a good question. And I think,
There's other stuff we've talked about where that never actually happened.
well, yeah, so let's look at the question from that point of view. In other words, let's say that let's say we don't know for sure if it actually was implemented or not. I think it was, but let's say that we're not sure about it. Why would the concept be enunciated in any case, especially if it's not going to actually be implemented? But what is the statement of there being some sort of safe zone for people who have committed what would otherwise be a serious or maybe even a capital offense?
It's not only safe for the individual, but it's safe for the community, because this person is disruptive to the community acting in this way.
So,
It's like why we put people, one of the reasons we put people in jail, because they're dangerous to the community. The community isn't safe with these people wandering around.
all right, let's pursue that for a minute. I want to introduce a term that we all are familiar with from our own legal system, which might help us a little bit. The term is protective custody.
Mhm.
And this applies in a lot of different situations where people might be inclined to take revenge, or there's an emotional component to the situation which might induce people to act in ways that would be inappropriate or illegal. Why do we put certain individuals in protective custody? And one point, of course, is to protect them, the person put in protective custody, from the anger or the irrationality or the mob psychology of other people who are damaged or grieved because of whatever it is that the person has done. And we might normally expect those people to take revenge. And so we set up something to protect the individual who otherwise might be the subject of revenge. Yeah, Stan.
I'm just thinking that maybe it's just because of popular culture, but I think one of the most oftentimes people are put in protective custody if they're a potential witness to a crime, rather than
Yes.
that they have committed any crime themselves.
Yes, it could be, for example, that they have committed a crime. There might be retaliation, or it may be simply that they are subject to the emotional vagaries of people who are, in fact, or only imagine themselves to be aggrieved and might be willing to take the law into their own hands. So what we're dealing with, I got Remy, then I got Deb. What we're dealing with is how to channel the anger or the hateful feelings that people might have with regard to an individual who has committed some kind of offense or who is alleged to have fulfilled some offense. How do we protect that individual? And also, how do we protect the avenging individual or community who now, if they act on these emotions, may be incurring guilt themselves,
Mhm.
for which they are now liable? So Remy and then Deb.
You have to unmute yourself.
I think your voice is
About
mute.
that, I have my allergy. Yeah, I feel like that period why the city of refuge is created, it will give the avenger and the manslayer and the family and the community have a chance to reflect what happened. It's like a cooling off period,
Mhm.
a time of peace, because when there's a lot of emotions involved, I always say you cannot let emotion rule you. You have to use this one, the rational and all that.
Yeah, and let me point out with regard to that, because I agree with you, Remy. If we are dealing with the emotions that that run high on the side of the aggrieved party, or the aggrieved, or the relative, the family of the aggrieved party, or the culprit himself or herself, these emotions may not necessarily fade away. They may be harbored for years and years and years. And what I want to point out is that with many things, and this falls into this kind of category, the end is going to have to be determined arbitrarily, because the emotions involved may or may not ever fade away. And because of that, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, those emotions might still exist. They might still be activated. And because of that situation, there's no logical or reasonable endpoint. You know, this is what goes through my mind. You think about what happens, let's say, in a situation where a husband and wife get divorced. Sometimes there are amicable divorces, and sometimes they're not so amicable, but people harbor and nurture even the anger and the other hateful emotions that are connected with that relationship, and they may never really go away. They may, give them the right provocation, they might pop up again at some loony time down the road. But what the text is saying is that the idea is to somehow neutralize the continued sense of grievance that might be on the side of the aggrieved party or his family, and on the side of the manslayer, of the manslaughterer, there is similarly, there is no necessary end to the emotions that are involved in the experience for that person either, whether it is the hate to the person who they hurt, or maybe sense of guilt that they feel because of the what their actions led to. So Deb, you're next. Then I get Stan.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, but I think I'm going to abdicate my turn, because I'm finding my question now to seem irrelevant, because I feel like I'm very confused now. I feel like the focus of what I think we're going for keeps switching every other sentence. And so now I'm like not really thinking my question is relevant. I think I'm lost in the woods. So I think I would be better off to just keep listening. Thank you.
All right, I'm sorry. It sounds like something I ought to understand better. All right, Stan.
Yeah. How upsetting was it when a high priest died? In other words, if the high priest is really, really revered, is that enough of a counter emotion to make everything else fade away, and that would be a good time then to let these inadvertent killers go back to their livelihood?
Well, that is an excellent question, and here is an analogy that I'll put out there just for consideration. Let's compare this situation to the death of a president, and I suppose it could be a king or whatever. When Harry Truman died, or when Dwight Eisenhower died, I'm sure there were a lot of people who were sad or angry, but their reaction was not much like the reaction of people to the assassination of John Kennedy. In part because in one case it's an assassination, but the attachment to the figure is very different. So because of that, it's not always the same set of emotions that come into play. So let's say that two people, husband and wife, are going to go through a divorce. In one case, they've just grown apart and the relationship isn't all that wonderful. And there are things that are missing from it. That's one thing. It's another thing, maybe, if one of the parties was guilty of adultery and had tried to cover this up, hide whatever it was that they were doing. Again, the feelings would be very different depending upon those circumstances. So one of the things that we're talking about here is in the case of the manslaughterer, it may be that the people who are aggrieved because of the death of their kinsman or what have you, they may or may not know the circumstances of how this death took place. They might have suspicions, they might have heard rumors, they might have wonder about it, but they may not really have any information. The question is, in a way, does it matter? And if so, how does it matter whether or not the family or the group that is affected by the death of this person, does it matter how much they know? Does it matter what they suspect took place? I'm wondering about it because it seems to me none of these things are very cut and dry. All right, Stan.
Yeah, I'm going back to the earlier question, if I
All
may.
right.
You pointed out Truman and Eisenhower. Go
Yes.
back to the country's reaction when Truman's predecessor died in office, when Roosevelt died.
Oh, a very,
Much
very
more
different reaction.
traumatic experience for Americans, and we're in the middle of a war, and I think that's a better parallel to the high priest who's in office dying.
Maybe so. I mean, certainly the reaction of Americans in general to the death of FDR was very different than their reaction to the death of, I don't know, Franklin Pierce. I mean, people had lived with FDR as president, some of them all their lives. They didn't know a president other than FDR. So there was a kind of bond that existed between this individual and the general population that might not be true simply because somebody occupied the position of president. In FDR's case, people had lived with him being president through the Depression, through the Second World War. These are elements of a relationship that are very different than just knowing that a certain guy was the president. There's an emotional loading there that might not be universally the case with others who are also positionally uh, uh, in the same relationship because they happen to be president. I don't imagine anybody wept openly when Calvin Coolidge died. I mean, I may be wrong about that, but that's my suspicion. But with FDR or John Kennedy or certain other presidents, it was very clear that the emotional attachments were very much deeper. Yeah. So you know, we can explore the emotions involved and how they might play out in the reaction people would have to some sort of grievance. Uh, on the other hand, there is an impact, maybe not, obviously not as deep, but there is some impact simply because there is a positional relationship, you know, so that, or let's say in a family, you don't really know your grandfather very well because he lived far away, and when you were a young person, he lived in a assisted living facility, so you didn't really get to know your grandfather in a deep sort of way. But losing a grandparent will be a wrenching experience, no matter how well or how little you knew them. Of course, I mean, it could be more or less, but just losing a parent or grandparent will have an emotional impact, aside from the question of how well or how close you related. There are some presidents that people loved for a variety of reasons, and others, not so much. So, uh, in the case of the manslayer, so somebody who has to go to the city of refuge, perhaps we're dealing with somebody who has to contend with these varied levels of emotion. And the question then becomes, how wide open or how narrow is the field that uh, the field of emotion that could lead to retaliation? You know, so let's think about, I mean, FDR is a good example. FDR died in office and people loved FDR, you know, the fireside chats and all of that kind of stuff. But he died of natural causes. John Kennedy was only president for 2.5 years. But the level of emotional attachment to Kennedy was very deep on the part of many people. And it was in part because of his personality, but in part, large part, because he was assassinated. You know, a young man in the bloom of life or whatever, and he didn't die of natural causes. He died because he was murdered by somebody. I think I know who, but it's one of the many questions that I don't get asked. So so let's look at this from the standpoint of a less lofty example. I hate to say it, but I'll go back to this question of grandparents. Um, in actuality, it's often the case that kids feel differently about one grandparent or one set of grandparents than the other. And it's not to say that one grandparent or one set of grandparents are better people or more worthwhile people than the other. But you know, maybe one set of grandparents lives out on the West Coast, and the other set of grandparents live in, I don't know, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Mhm.
And you know, and you don't see one, you see the other all the time. You build up a relationship. They're all grandparents, but you're going to be affected differently by the death of the ones who live in California than the ones who live in Halifax. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of people who live in Halifax at all. So, we have, even parents and children have these differences of feeling. I know that parents say, I love all my children the same, but I don't believe it. I think that parents have special feelings often, not always, but often for one child and not for another. And they may feel uncomfortable that they have those feelings, but I think it's quite common for that to be the case. So maybe you might lament the death of one child more or less than the other child. It doesn't make you a monster. It doesn't make you a monster, but it recognizes that the impact of emotion in family relationships is not uniform. So maybe there's some guy who gets killed inadvertently, and he was, the black sheep of the family, and he didn't have much of a relationship with the people in his family. And so the rest of the family says, well, gee, it's too bad that Uncle so-and-so has died. Let's move on with our game of mahjong or whatever. And on the other hand, it may be the case that people are deeply moved. And in fact, they may be so deeply moved that that emotion might skew their judgment, or it might be impossible to assimilate in a way that makes it, that sort of defangs it, makes it less dangerous to other people. Well, that may or may not happen. It doesn't happen in all cases. There may be an underlying strong emotion that continues to function for many, many years. Now, the reason I bring this up this way is that in other instances than the case of the manslaughter, the Torah basically makes the argument that at some point it's no longer reasonable or effective or allowable to continue to allow these deep irrational emotions to continue to influence how you live in your community or in your family. I got you, Judy. Give me 2 seconds. One of my favorite all-time lines from Jewish legal sources comes from the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law, which argues that excessive grief is forbidden. In other words, at a certain point, you may or may not still have certain feelings, but there has to be a limit to what you're permitted to do, because those emotions might still exist. You have to go back to your life. You have to continue life, and you have to be able to put into its proper place whatever hurt or whatever aggrievement you might have. All right, Judy. So
I was going to say that this is what you have just explained is a universal issue that props up in so many different cultures. And I'm thinking about the Southern Confederacy that needed to recognize, accept, grieve, mourn, whatever it is, that way of life that came to an end, supposedly.
yes,
Had a lot of paroxysms of deaths along the way that that preserved feelings, which you can see today by the discussions which we have about the Confederate statues, the names that we give buildings after Confederate heroes or whatever they are. And these folks who are still grieving for a way of life or something, or a great uncle that died during the war on behalf of the Confederacy. And how long, I mean, this goes on. I can, I am not a proponent or an advocate of Hungary in any way, don't misunderstand me, but but I understand that during after World War I, Hungary lost at least, was it 2/3 or 1/3 of its territory to other countries around it. And there are still those today who mourn the loss. So I mean, these issues continue around the world, what you're talking about.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And sometimes it can be almost inexplicable. My first wife came from a family where her mother and father were immigrants from Finland, and her native language was Finnish. She learned Finnish before she ever learned English, because that was what was spoken at home.
Mhm.
Well, there's a part of Finland called Karelia.
Uh-huh.
It's always gone back and forth between Finland and Russia.
Uh-huh.
And it is the center of what we might take Finnish folk culture, the Kalevala, with the great Finnish epic poem, comes from Karelia, and so on and so forth. So to Finns, this is a big deal. It's to others, you look out from outside, well, it's territory, but what does it mean? But in the scale of values in the national consciousness of the Finnish people, it's hugely important. But let's look at something a little bit less obscure. And we are not any less end of time yet. Let's look, for example, at what Judy brought up, and that is the lingering emotional attachment on the part of Southerners to the life that obtained in their part of the United States in the lead up to and the aftermath of the Civil War. It's amazing to me that people today will make the argument that the Civil War was about states' rights, not about slavery. When for example, in all the documents of the constitutions of the various southern states that were members of the Confederacy, nobody talks about states' rights, not one of them. They're all about the way of life connected with slavery, and how that it was an egregious offense that this was taken away because of the victory of the North in the Civil War. And it led to this irredentist urge on the part of the South, led to the most egregious political behaviors that we can point to in the United States. The existence of the
Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, Jim
that's part of what happened. In regard to Reconstruction, is what I was looking for. The South came up with a way of institutionalizing and continuing the existence of many of the worst elements of slavery,
Right.
and gave the imprimatur of the states to that. The idea of segregation, the idea of different the availability of different institutions, and even silly things like water fountains or public pools or whatever. These were all ways of continuing to allow and to support the existence of a culture that had been defeated in the course of the Civil War, but which people were unwilling to let go of. The Ku Klux Klan, of course, is a very good example, but it's not the only example. It's maybe the most egregious, but it was a justification for continuing the same institutions that had lost out in the Civil War.
Mhm.
You know, so one of the reasons that I think as Americans, and this is now we're going beyond the text, you know, it's one thing to recognize that there are emotions that people have that continue to exist and continue to impact their behaviors and their points of view. And it's another to take those same emotions and institutionalize them from a governmental point of view, which then has an impact on the life, continued life of those states or municipalities, or whatever. It would be one thing if Southerners had never or have never come to terms with their feelings about African Americans. It's another thing, I think a vastly worse thing, to erect this system of separate but equal in order to perpetuate a mythic view, a revisionist view of history, which then just makes all such behaviors justifiable. It's okay to deny people the vote because they weren't really citizens. This is yeah, Deb.
So doesn't this then make it seem, I'm listening to your words very carefully, and it seems like this idea then about this mythic, egregious error, isn't that then true in this passage we're reading? That
Yes.
if you're guilty of something now, but then you're not, doesn't it sort of become mythical?
Well, I think the point is that at a certain juncture, after a certain amount of time, after a certain amount of processing, even if the emotions don't disappear, even if they don't get sublimated, even if they don't get reincorporated in a healthy sort of way into people's lives, there comes a point where it has to stop. And if you refuse to let it stop, that's a problem. And what I think gets people upset, for example, I don't remember which of us mentioned it, the Confederate statues and plaques and so on and so forth, is that these are methods of continuing to allow the emotions connected with the Civil War to fester and to exist, instead of saying, okay, it's over, we need to move on. We need to recognize that at some point it is an arbitrary decision on our parts whether or not we're going to allow ourselves to continue to live without being governed by these the sense of aggrievement that we might have initially, and then maybe, or in some sense of memory, we continue to have them. But what is the purview of our lives that we are allowed to act this out in? Can you might want to say, oh well, the slaves were always singing and so on and so forth. Well, that's historically not true. They had terrible lives. But you could imagine trying to, somebody trying to burnish the memory of a terrible period or burnish the memory of the actual history. At some point, it has to stop. and you have to look at things as they are. Yeah, Deb.
So though throughout this whole conversation today, I keep thinking to myself, but people have perceptions and everybody has a different perception. And whether it's, the Ku Klux Klan or people from the South or the Confederacy, whatever you want to call it, everybody has their own perceptions of things. And so the point that you were just now making makes me realize that it's then incumbent upon each one of us to essentially regulate the emotions that are generated by those perceptions, because we have to recognize that we only know what we know. We don't ever know the whole truth. We don't know what it means to somebody else when they see that statue or when they think of this or that. And so that made me wonder then, because it's very hard for people to do. It's very, very hard for people to acknowledge that their perceptions are only half of the picture and that there's something they don't know, and to imagine how that fits. If you don't know it, how do you imagine to fit it in with what you do know? And so it makes me wonder then if the Torah is in a sense kind of giving us this directive, because human beings are so poor at being able to get to that place where they regulate that perception and say, maybe I do, maybe I don't, but it's time to put it to rest and move on. Most of us are very, very challenged to do that. And maybe the Torah was saying, I know people are challenged to do that. So here's a I don't want to say dictate, but here's a
Mechanism?
yes, a mechanism to help people to be able to move on, because they won't on their own.
I agree with you, and I think that the proof of the pudding is that even the Torah recognizes that these feelings of revenge or anger or hatred for some culpable party, because we may not be able to integrate them effectively into the way that we live or the way we view things, that cannot be allowed to continue indefinitely. There has to be some way of bringing that to an end. And with all of us, to some degree, that point where we have to end it may be arbitrary. We might still have some of these feelings, but after a certain amount of time, after a certain amount of history, you're not entitled to act on them in the same way you were the year after the event took place, let's say. You have it. This is why in the Shulchan Aruch, for example, with regard to the laws of mourning, the text says excessive grief is prohibited. At a certain point, it has to end. You might still have feelings of sadness and so on and so forth, but you have to, if you can't reintegrate all this into your life, that doesn't mean you have carte blanche to continue to act that way. We'll end here in a second, but one of my favorite examples of this from popular culture comes from the movie Anti-Maine, which is Sergeant Rosalind Russell, a whole bunch of great people. And at one point, her husband, who's a Southerner, dies while climbing a mountain in the Alps. And for a year, Maine wears all black. And her best friend, the Broadway actress, I forget the name, the character, says to Mame, don't you think you could have gone to purple by now? I said, to me, that's a brilliant idea, because the truth is we don't allow ourselves to go to purple sometimes. We maintain a stance somehow, either because we are unwilling to or unable to deal with the emotions, or because we think that people would have a negative view of us because of these emotions. We can't get past, we get stuck at a certain point. So I think that's, in my view, that's why the tenure of the high priest or any other relatively arbitrary marker might be at a certain point the only way you can move past it. All right, it's not appropriate any longer. This is no longer something that's within my my purview to act about. So, all right, Deb, you're going to get the last word.
So so the analogy in our common rhetoric is people saying to somebody you care about, you need to let it go. You know, I get your pain, I see you're going, but you need to let it go.
Exactly.
The difference though between that and the passage we're reading is that the priest had some authority to say, you need to let it go. And when somebody says to us, you need to let it go, we can take that helpfully, or we can take that with some sense of defiance.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's right on target. The point being that in one case, we're talking about the life of an individual or the private lives of individuals. But in the Torah text we're talking about the life of the nation, the life of large groups of people, tribal or what have you. It's not just how I feel personally, but how my personal feelings impact the lives of all sorts of people. And so at that point, it seems appropriate for some authority figure to step in and say, okay, genug, it's enough. You need to go on. All right. Thank you all very much for discussion, and we'll meet again next Thursday.
Great to
Thank
see
you,
everybody.
Rabbi.
Hi, everyone.
Bye
Bye,
bye,
everyone.
everyone. Bye bye. Thank you.